Hi everyone, it is end of year wrap up time, so I am here to give you a little wrap up of what I read this year. We're going to start with DNFs and Unhauls. I am going to go over the DNFs first. For DNFs, there were 13 books that I, for whichever reason, couldn't finish, and we'll go through these in the order in which I tried to read them. The first DNF of the year for me was Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. The description of this book, as per kind of Goodreads and Storygraph, is it is a girl who is feeling very lonely and not a part of her family, and she has a plush hedgehog that she thinks is an alien from outer space, which I thought was very cute and I was very interested to read. And then there was some themes of child abuse and other types of abuse of children, and I wasn't enjoying the plot enough to continue with the story past that point. This one is quite well acclaimed. I think that might have been a theme of the book in her coping with it. I just decided that it wasn't something I wanted to read any further about. The second DNF for me was Synners by Pat Cadigan. This I see very often recommended on the same cyberpunk lists as the Sprawl trilogy by William Gibson and Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson. And so I actually had to request this via interlibrary loan from my library system. I couldn't find it in any used bookstores, and my local library didn't have a copy. And I think that contributed to why I decided to DNF it. The book was split into some quite short little sections, and it would jump from character to character to character. And by the time I figured out, right, that's who Jack is, this section would be over and we'd be moving on to the next character, and it was just much too convoluted of a web of characters for me to keep track of. I got maybe 90 pages in when it started to become due at the library within the next couple days, and I kind of had to make the decision as to whether I was going to push myself to read it nonstop to get through it before the due date, or just return it without finishing it, and I opted for the second option. I would be interested maybe in checking something out from Pat Cadigan other than Synners, because I do like the cyberpunk genre. I just found Synners very hard to follow for me, and I didn't want some late fees. 3 I didn't finish was The Liar by Stephen Fry. QI is probably one of my favorite shows of all time, so I was really interested when I learned that Stephen Fry had written some novels. I read The Hippopotamus last year, and boy was that book weird. I didn't enjoy it. But I love Stephen Fry's Greek myth series, so I figured I would try to give one of his novels another go, and I picked up The Liar. And interestingly, this was another interlibrary loan, which means that there is a little bit more of a time pressure compared to a regular library loan. I found the characters in this book insufferable to the point I couldn't continue reading. And it is possible to do an insufferable character, Yellowface being a great example of that, of you cannot stand the main character, but that's kind of supported enough by an interesting plot to keep the interest. I didn't know where The Liar was going. I didn't like any of the characters, and I had to return it to the library, so I did. And I don't regret it. I will never know what happens. And Stephen Fry, please write a better novel. Please. I want to love your writing so much. But The Hippopotamus and The Liar were not it. The next DNF is the only one that I actually spent money on. It's the only one that I have a physical copy of, and that is the original illustrated Sherlock Holmes. I have owned this book since 2012. When I pulled this off my shelf in January of this year, I actually found cue cards from a high school French project inside of it. That is how long I have owned this book. I had the best of intentions at the beginning of this year. I put little tabs on the side of this that were approximately 1/12 of the book, and I was going to try to read 1/12 of it each month and finish it by the end of this year. I think I gave up. I think this tab here was what I was supposed to read in April, so I only read 3 months worth. I've marked this as a DNF. It is a soft DNF. I have every intention at some point to finish this. I just can't sit and read a lot of them back to back, which is why I thought spreading it across a year would finally help me. But there were just other things I wanted to read more. So maybe next year is the year that I finally finish the original illustrated Sherlock Holmes. On the DNF list for 2023 was Wilder Girls by Rory Power. Wilder Girls is about this school for girls, I think, that is currently under quarantine because there's a toxic plague thing spreading that causes people to mutate and grow weird body parts, I think turn into kind of animals. I knew going in that it was a young adult novel, and sometimes young adult novels are written for 17, 8 years old, and sometimes young adult novels are written for 13, 14 years old. I felt that this one was on the younger scale of young adult, which just means it wasn't that good at capturing my interest. You have this big, interesting world building going on with this plague that infects people and mutates their bodies, and the parts that I got through was all about one person trying to find their bestie who disappeared. And I didn't care for the characters enough to care what happened to the friend who disappeared or the friend whose friend disappeared. So yeah, I found the writing a little bit on the younger side than what I would prefer. Doesn't mean that the novel is bad at all. It just wasn't particularly my style of book, and maybe I would have preferred it if it was for a bit older of an audience. Okay, this one might be a bit unpopular. I DNF'd Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. In my defense, I was listening to it as an audiobook, and I fell asleep. And when I woke up, I realized that I had missed a whole bunch of what was going on, and I didn't really have the interest to go back and try and re-listen to what I missed, so I just decided to DNF it. I will probably go back to this one again at some point with a physical copy. I just found that with the kind of older style of English language, it wasn't working for me as an audiobook, so maybe a hard copy I will try again at some point. I did also try to listen to it, I think in the spring. I think it was like May, which is not spooky season. Well, horror season is all year round. I feel like Frankenstein is maybe a spooky season one, so maybe we'll try again next fall. But for now, soft DNF. Next was Persephone Station by Stina Lich. Persephone Station, according to the description on Goodreads, is about a main character who runs a bar on a colonized planet and joins up with a bunch of ragtag criminals to take on the army. That's what the description says. I could not tell you a single detail of this book from memory, and that is part of why I DNF'd it. I was finding while I was reading it that if I would put it down and the next time I picked it up, I'd be like, where are we? Who are these people? Because so little of it was memorable that even while I was reading, I was forgetting what was happening. And at that point, if a book is not grabbing me, I'm just gonna DNF it. When looking for science fiction, I don't tend to pick the science fiction that's about settler colonies. I don't find settling on new planets to be particularly my favorite type of science fiction. So maybe if that is something that you're interested in, it might be something for you. But for me, this wasn't interesting enough to keep me going. So, DNF. My DNF list was A Dark Matter by Peter Straub. Going into this one, I had read in the description that it was about an experiment going wrong, so I'm thinking sci-fi thriller, and then I start the book, and it is rambly, and it's set in the 1960s, which I don't particularly find an interesting decade, and I was on the fence about DNFing this, and then I go into the reviews to see if I should continue it, if there is a payoff, and a lot of 2-star and 1-star reviews. I think on Storygraph is a 2.86 average, and a lot of the comments were, it took so long to get to the point, and the point didn't deserve all the effort I put in. So I decided that I wasn't gonna put in the effort if I wasn't grabbed by it. So I decided to DNF this one, and I think the audiobook was like 15 hours long, so it was a bit chonky even at 2x speed for me, so sorry to Mr. Straub, but I DNF'd this book. The next book on the list I DNF'd is a nonfiction book called Cobalt, The Making of a Mining Superpower. This was nominated in the Evergreen Forest of Reading Awards, which is why I picked it up. It is by a Canadian author about the cobalt mining industry in Canada specifically. And I was actually enjoying this book for the first 100 pages. It is something I'm not particularly educated on, and it was really interesting to learn something new. But after the first 100 pages, I felt like I knew all I wanted to know about the cobalt mining industry, and I wasn't particularly interested in mining enough to want to read the other 236 pages. So if this had been like a 20-page essay, would have loved it. But for a 336 book, it's just not particularly a topic that could keep me interested for that long. But if you are interested in mining in Canada, I would recommend it. It was really well written. It just wasn't a topic that I wanted to continue reading. Next DNF is Magic Bites by Ilona Andrews. This was actually recommended to me by a friend because I said I was looking for some fantasy vampires. Might have been during my Baldur's Gate 3 phase, and she recommended Magic Bites. I did start the book, and I think it just confirmed for me that urban fantasy isn't particularly my genre. I don't particularly enjoy where there's this magic world but also modern technology. It can work in rare circumstances, but I don't think it's particularly a genre I enjoy. I would rather keep my fantasy and my technology science fiction. So I think it was just a genre that I wasn't interested in, similar to how Persephone Station wasn't my type of sci-fi. So you try new things, you learn about your preferences, and sometimes it means you don't finish a book. If urban fantasy is your interest, according to my friend Molly, it is a very good book. So maybe give that a try. Otherwise, if it's not your genre, I don't think it's worth it. The second nonfiction book on this list is No Applause, Just Throw Money, the book that made vaudeville famous by Trav Esty. I have a degree in film studies. I find burlesque and vaudeville to be very interesting topics, so I was very excited to read this book. This is probably the toughest DNF to talk about because it is based a lot on how I felt about a specific part of the book. I'm not assuming the author's intent here, And I am also coming to this topic as someone whose expertise is not vaudeville. But at about 30 or 40 pages in, the topic of blackface comes up because there was a lot of vaudeville that was rooted in minstrelsy, which included blackface. And a point was made about how at the time there was not that big of an outcry about blackface. I admit that because I'm not as well researched on vaudeville, that might be true, but I felt like maybe it might have been missing cultural context, and the author being white might not be the best person to be making that call. So I decided that I would DNF this particular book about vaudeville, and I would be interested in maybe trying to find essays written by people of color, Black people specifically, and see if that is indeed true or something that was missing some cultural context. So I didn't particularly want to continue the book after that. I did DNF it from there, and I might try to find some other source to learn about the history of vaudeville. The next one, if you watch my November wrap-up, you might already know, is a specific edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses. I did finish Ovid's Metamorphoses, but a different edition. The first edition I tried to read was written like I used to write my university notes, which was bullet points, summarizing what's happening, but then maybe some snarky comments in brackets. It very much read bullet point, and I felt that this is supposed to be a poem. It was missing a lot of the lyricism I would assume that a poem had, and I had shared some quotes of the book with my sibling who had read Ovid's Metamorphoses prior, and they said that doesn't seem quite like I remember that. And so I returned that copy to the library, and then about a week later I was in a used bookstore and I found a different edition or different translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that one actually preserved the lyricism of the poetry, and I did manage to finish it. So that one specific edition, I think the book said it was translated by Charles Bohr. Avoid that one. Apologies to that man, you probably put a lot of effort into your translation. It just, we can do better, and others have done better. So last DNF for 2023, as long as the next 2 weeks go okay, is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez. This is a horror novel about a family who has the ability to see spirits and has some kind of witchy coven-y vibes going on. Our Share of Night is a very long book. I think the audiobook was about 25 hours and I got through 12 hours of it. It is so slow-paced. Storygraph says medium-paced. I don't agree with that. It is so slow-paced. 12 hours in, I'm like, did anything even happen? Like a couple things maybe, but where are we going? And I don't think that what was set up in the first 12 hours was gonna be worth me sticking around for another 13. So maybe in that second half, it really picks up and it ends up being worth it. I have heard great things about it. It seems really well rated. It was just a little on the slower side for me, so I decided to DNF it, especially in December when it's end of year, get those last books in. Can we set a personal best? I don't want to be slowed down by a long book that's slow paced and that I'm dreading having to read. So I DNF'd it to move on to something else, and if it continues to get good reviews, I might go back and try and read it, but I think for me it was just a little bit too atmospheric horror and a little bit too slow paced. So those are the books that I DNF'd in 2023, and now I'm going to throw in the few books that I am going to unhaul in 2023. So for the end of 2023, there are 4 books that I intend to unhaul. The first is Strange Secrets of the Loch Ness Monster. I found this in a used bookstore this summer, and when I looked it up on Goodreads, it only had like 10 reviews. It wasn't on Storygraph at all. I had to have it added. Turns out with good reason. This book was terrible. It was just a lot of like, well, this person claims they saw something. And then this other person claims they saw something different. And then this person claims they saw this. It was strange. Also, this book has some brown spots on it, and I'm worried that might be book mold. So we keep this away from all the other books, and we're gonna unhaul it. Next, we have A Brief History of Misogyny. I have owned this book for years. I got probably this book around the same time I got the Sherlock Holmes one. And I finally read it last year, which I was very proud of because it's been on my shelf for a very long time. And I don't feel the need to reread it. I feel accomplished that I did, but I'm not gonna read it again. So, goodbye. Sorry to this book. Next, I feel a little bit bad about because it was a gift from a friend, but I read it and I'm not gonna read it again, and it's taking up room on my shelf. Text from Jane Eyre and Other Conversations with Your Favorite Literary Characters. This is just like fake text conversations between book characters, and it's all classics. Have I read enough classics to understand the majority of what's in here? So maybe someone who is more of a classics fan will enjoy this. I'm probably going to drop these off at the library because they have like a little volunteer-run used bookstore in the library, but my apologies to the friend who bought this for me, but I don't want it anymore. I read it. What's this? It doesn't spark joy anymore. Is that? I'm sure Mary Kondo has something to say about this, but appreciation to that friend, but not appreciation to this book. And the last book that I'm going to unhaul in 2023 is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. This was a tough cut because I had to make room on my rainbow shelf, and this is a red book. But also, technically, this no longer fits on that shelf because it's no longer a standalone. It was when I bought it. I don't want to read the Testaments. I'm sorry. I don't want to buy the Testaments. I don't want to read the Testaments. So why am I going to keep the first book of a series when I have no interest in continuing said series? Margaret Atwood, Canadian institution. The amount of copies of this book that are in every single used bookstore I go to, astronomical. If I want to get another copy of it, I could for like $1 or $2. But I don't think I'm ever going to reread this, so why am I holding on to it? Goodbye, Margaret Atwood. So those are all of the DNFs and on-hauls that I have in 2023. Apologies to all of the authors. It's not you, it's me. And if you made it through this video, leave down below a book that you gave up on this year. I'll see you guys in the next video.